Welcome to Disrupting Peace, a show about why peace hasn't worked and how it still could. I'm Bridget Conley, Research Director at the World Peace Foundation. Today, it's clear that the U.S. is backsliding when it comes to democracy and human rights. And it is not just us. There's a global shift towards concentrating power in the hands of an ever smaller group of men, and it's nearly always men, at the top. So this season, we're looking at examples of resistance from 6 countries to see what we can learn. Scholars, activists, and politicians will help us understand how leaders attempt to concentrate power and how people fight back. To kick off the season, we're focusing on Iceland, the country ranked number 1 for gender equality for 15 years in a row. I'll be speaking with Silja Bára Ómarsdóttir and Tatjana Latinović. Silja Bára Ómarsdóttir is a professor of international affairs at the University of Iceland. Her research includes Icelandic and feminist foreign policy, national security, and reproductive rights. Tatjana Latinović has lived in Iceland since 1994, when she relocated there from Croatia. She's a vice president of intellectual property at Össur, a medical device company. But most relevant to this conversation, she's a human rights activist, focusing on feminist and immigrant issues in Iceland, and is the current president of the Icelandic Women's Rights Association. Together, we explore what makes Iceland unique, how younger generations are pushing the feminist agenda forward, and why limiting freedom around parental leave has increased equality in this volcanic Nordic country. Silja, Tatjana, welcome to Disrupting Peace.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I want to start with looking at key metrics related to gender equality. For over a decade, Iceland has been ranked number 1, the country with the greatest gender equality in the world, according to the Global Gender Gap Index, which examines women's equality across economics, education, health, and politics. So to put Iceland's ranking in context, I have a brief quiz for the two of you. Silja, I wonder, can you name one of the 3 non-European countries that also ranks in the top 10?
Rwanda? No?
I was going to mention Rwanda.
They did really well in politics, at least.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the 3 non-European top 10 are New Zealand,
Yeah.
Nicaragua,
Mm-hmm.
which I didn't know much about at all, and Namibia in Africa.
Namibia, yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, Tatjana, your question. Where does the U.S. rank? And that's where a lot of our listeners come from. It's not in the top 10, but of the 146 countries ranked in 2024, is the U.S. in the teens, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, or the 50s?
I'd say 50s.
Yeah, just underneath. We're apparently at 43.
43, yeah.
And my guess is we may hit in the 50s in the near future.
Yes, yeah.
So I also wanted to note that Iceland frequently ranks as one of the world's most peaceful countries. And it's one of 2 countries that do not have a military that we'll be talking about this season on Disrupting Peace. The other one we're looking at is Costa Rica. But the key point of my quiz was to highlight that by common indicators of gender equality, Iceland is doing great. So, Tatjana, I want to start with you. What are some of the reasons why Iceland ranks so high?
I think we rank so high because of political participation and the reason that we had the woman president for 16 years. Vigdis Finnbogadóttir really drives that courage. So that, I think, gives us a lot of scores. And we have a woman president now, elected last year. So I think that we will stay in that position. But even by those metrics, which are important, we haven't reached complete equality. We're just not as bad as the rest of the world. But the things that are not measured and do not fit in those metrics.
Tatjana, that's exactly my next question. And I wanted to pose this one to Silja. So take us beyond the numbers. What's the difference between measuring change through metrics and measuring it in terms of transformation?
The Global Gender Gap Report addresses the four main issues that you mentioned, but as soon as we start bringing in gender-based violence and sexual violence, Iceland drops significantly. This is one of the lagging metrics that we've seen where Iceland is not as good as the neighboring countries, for example.
People often say that small Northern European countries like Iceland have more equality because the population is more homogenous. Can you share a bit more about the people of Iceland?
Yeah, the Iceland I grew up in was white completely. I remember the first time I saw somebody who had different color skin, and I think I was about 9. And we share a language, which is spoken uniformly across the whole country. Everybody my age and older, we can all trace our heritage back to the settlers who came here in the 9th century. So we have a very strong national identity. By now, we have a population, immigrant population, or people of foreign background, over 20% of the population. Some are here for a short time. Some are living here permanently and have done so for decades. And we also had, we're a Nordic welfare society. We've had fairly strong economic equity. We like to consider ourselves a classless society. We're seeing some cleavages in that, I think, by now. And the worst thing is that goes a lot on immigrant and native-born differences.
Silja, can you say a few more words about what is a Nordic welfare society?
A Nordic welfare society refers to a society where we have public health insurance, for example. We have public schools, which are provided free of charge. We pay very minimal fees for visiting doctors, etc. Daycare is universal for children under primary school age, although it is paid for out of pocket for parents.
It is subsidized by municipalities.
Yeah. So it's a public good. I think the fees are, if you have one child, maybe around $250.
Yeah,
most municipalities, yeah.
A month?
Per month, yeah. And we pay high taxes, but when you compare what you get for them, I think it's actually not so much higher than in many other countries. But we're used to having welfare services provided for by the state rather than having to procure them out of pocket.
We have a sort of social safety net.
Yeah,
I'd say that.
exactly, the social safety net. And there's some interesting research on creativity. A woman at the University of Kansas, if I remember correctly, came to Iceland and got introduced to Icelandic music, and she thought it was like, the inspiring nature and like the darkness and the light and whatever. But a lot of the people she talked to was like, well, it's easy to be creative when your children have daycare and they could go to the doctors, and it's like that. That takes out the big pressures that most of us face.
So can I just follow up? How much is tuition at the university?
We don't have tuition. We have a registration fee. We do have a couple of private universities in Iceland, but the public universities, we charge about $500 per year as a registration fee, but it's a public good. Education is a public good in Iceland.
Wow. Well, let's change gears and talk about a policy that gets to the heart of gender equality, parental leave. What has Iceland done?
What Iceland did in 2000 when it established the new framework for parental leave, it was the first to tie a specific share of the leave to the father, or now the second parent. And we saw a huge change in how that affected the status of women and men in the labor market, where all of a sudden men became an unpredictable asset in the labor market, which women had been before, because they would carry the children and they had the right to the parental leave. And now employers had to also assume that men would take, and now it's men of all ages, because women age out of, people with uteruses can't carry children after a certain age, but now men of all ages actually can continue taking parental leave. So now they've become a less stable worker, which means that employers need to consider all people at a more equal level.
So how has the policy evolved over the years?
When the law was passed in 2000, there's a mandatory comment from the Ministry of Finance. Every law that is proposed has to go through the Ministry of Finance that assesses the impact that law will have on the state budget. And the comment on the parental leave that conditioned 3 months of it to men was that no foreseeable impact for the state budget. And turns out it was because the Ministry of Finance did not believe that men would use it. And men, turns out, fathers care about their children.
Yeah.
And they wanted to take time. And there was a young man who was in a very high-paid position, and he had twins, and then I think maybe another set of twins. At least they had 4 children in 3 years, he and his wife. And he took the full amount of parental leave that he was entitled to. And he and some other men who were in these kinds of salaries, they emptied the fund because there was no cap. You know, even though it was like 80% of his salary, it was still so high that then the law was amended. And so now there's a cap of about $6,000 approximately per month. So your salary, your income actually drops.
And how long is paid parental leave in Iceland?
So at the beginning, when the paternity leave was institutionalized, and this change was made in 2000, the leave was 9 months. 3 months would go to the mother, 3 to the father, and 3 months were to share. And the 3 months would usually be taken by the mother because their salaries would be lower.
It's always the mother. So a few years ago, there was a legislation that said that we will extend the parental leave will be 12 months. And my organization and some other feminist and labor unions organizations were advocating that it should be equally split. So 6 months to one parent, 6 months to another parent. And they can share 6 weeks out of it. So if the father does not use his 6 months, they will just, disappear. Mother cannot take it. And this is a great equality tool in the labor market, because when employers are employing a young man or young woman, they sort of can assume that both of them will take a parental leave if they decide to have children. So it affects the position even of young women that will never have children or they don't pay, because they will not be discriminated against.
So is it 6 months, use it or lose it for each parent plus an additional 6 weeks?
No, it's not. 6 weeks is included in this 1 year.
Okay, so it's 4.5 months, use it or lose it for each parent, and they get to choose who takes the remaining 6 weeks.
Yeah.
Has there been any resistance to the policy?
Yeah, that's maybe an example of things that people take for granted, young people, because, there was a pushback by even young people that are in a situation now that have to take parental leave. Some voices were that this government shouldn't be telling people what to do with their parental leave. They should just decide that themselves. But we know what would happen then. It would be mothers that would be taking more in heterosexual relationship, that would be taking more of that time. Why? Because it's a traditional role of a woman to take care of a baby, but also we still have the wage gap. We are not equal, so people cannot afford fathers to take a time off work because you don't get paid full salary. You get paid a certain percentage. That's when we realized that people really don't know where the whole thing of parental leave comes from. They just think it's just a given that you have it and you can just decide whatever you want,
Yeah, that's what I thought was so interesting about that example, is that it's, to impose equality. And then people are saying, well, what about our choices then and our ability to make decisions? But those decisions invariably reinforce the inequalities.
Yeah. But I should also mention that it isn't researched a lot, and Silja Bára can speak to that, because the academics here at the university research the parental leave a lot from all sides and aspects, and it has only done good to families and to fathers and to marriages and children. So I think that we in general have very positive experience of both parents taking that leave. I work with a lot of young people. I think that all the young men would just love to stay at home, because there is no stigma about it. There is no, you're not being man enough if you're taking care of your kid. That doesn't happen here. I don't think so.
Even more the opposite, I think.
Yeah.
So Silja, you also work with young people at the university every day. What changes are you seeing over time in how younger people in Iceland are articulating a gender equality agenda or concerns?
I think what Tatjana is saying about people sort of thinking that the rights that they have are guaranteed and came out of nowhere almost, that there's not a lot of necessarily connection with the fights that had to be fought to create these rights. But what I see them doing more is expanding these rights. They think about racial discrimination. They think about gender identities beyond the binary. They relate their interest to the environmental fight, resisting climate change, etc. So their worldview is far more broad, intersectional than my generation's. I mean, I remember the 1983 elections where the number of women in parliament went from 3 to 9 in one night. I grew up seeing very few women on TV or in the newspapers as role models for political participation. So overall, I see positive movements. But then we also see, like Tatjana was saying, the financial realities. What remains is fixing the gender pay gap in relationships, heterosexual relationships where you have a male and a female. Usually the male will have higher salaries.
So as I look around the U.S., there's this rising tide of conservatism that seeks to reduce gender equality by restricting how we even talk about it, how we teach about it, limiting access to reproductive rights and more, and often in the name of protecting women. So these efforts will be and are being fought against. Do you think there are lessons that we can learn from the Icelandic movement about how you build and sustain and expand a movement over time? Silja, I'll start with you on this one.
It's difficult to, because the context is so different. I think we've, in Iceland, benefited from being, at the beginning, very homogenous, that it was easy to reach, people who, even if they had politically opposed viewpoints, they shared so many other characteristics. And in the U.S., there are so many bridges to cross to reach people.
So you speak to an Icelander for 2 minutes,
Yeah.
you will find common cousin, friend, or workplace.
Yeah, you've gone to the same school, you had the same teachers, you worked in the same summer jobs or, something like that. So they don't come from these radically different places. Like you have somebody coming from Alabama or from, LA, where you just have really, really different environments. So it will be harder to be inclusive as society becomes more diverse, because it's more difficult to reach people who have a different language, who don't have access to the same social capital.
Do you think there are no lessons then? I mean, what about the engaging and maintaining a movement? How does that happen over time? How do you continue to feed and nurture and expand that movement?
Well, I think that's what's been successful here is the sort of constant renovation or rejuvenation of the movements. The Women's Rights Association here is almost 120 years old. We've always had this, like, okay, there's something going on, I want to see something different, and people organize around it. And again, that might be because it's easy to reach out and the smallness makes it accessible. But it's also like the fights have been in many ways close to home, that, there's an issue. So I think that's something that you can relate to or try to transfer is what are the problems in your immediate neighborhood and your immediate environment that need to be addressed, because that can be daycare, that can be elder care, lifting the burden of care work that falls on women far more than it does on men.
And I welcome, all these, new revolutions being with like free the nipple girls, and
Wait, sorry. You're going to have to say, Tatjana, what was that?
Sorry, I don't know if I should say free the nipple. 10 years ago, can you believe it? I thought it was like last year, but it was 10 years ago that girls from various colleges here just freed their nipples, took off their bras and marched to protest sexist behavior of boys in schools.
Slut shaming.
Slut shaming and everything. That was great, and so we, as older generations, and as organization that I'm heading, we need to sort of embrace and celebrate that there's plenty of room in feminism for various voices. Just like men do not agree on everything, women do not have to agree on everything, So I think that is just very healthy to have these discussions. I speak a lot with activists in US and students, they come to visit, so there's a lot going on, but obviously it's more difficult and more complicated to mobilize and to do stuff on a larger scale than it is in Iceland, 390,000 people.
Yeah, and I would not argue that the women's movement or the gender equality movement in the U.S. is not doing this, but I think to me it resonates to hear about a movement that comes and is tied to people concerned with their immediate, very, very local context and trying to improve their lives.
But then you won't reach equality only counting on grassroots movements to fight for it. This needs to be institutionalized, and this needs to go to legislation. That is, I think, the secret of success at least in Iceland.
And I think that's maybe, where the lesson can come. It's like, running for office, taking the steps that are needed to change your local legislatures, your local town council, etc. Because that's what the Women's List and the Women's Party here did in 1982 and 1983, was just put women up for office and supporting women for office. When the Women's Party was disbanded in the late 90s and didn't run in 1999, all the other political parties realized that they had to put women somewhere in the leadership, because otherwise they wouldn't get the women's votes, or the one party would do it and they would get the women's votes. So, organize locally, try to affect your local decision-making bodies.
And become a part of decision-making.
Exactly.
So I'd like to ask both of you about the impact of younger generations on how you view gender equality. Do you have any examples of an interaction with a younger person that changed your views about gender equality?
There was a group on Facebook, I think, that was called Beauty Tips, and there mostly girls, were exchanging information about, here you can find a nice mascara, and this is how you put your tan on, or whatever. And then for some reason, it was like a safe space, I guess. Many thousand Icelandic women were writing that they started sharing stories of sexual violence and domestic violence, and we call it the Beauty Tips revolution that came out of it. It was very, very interesting. And this was a few years before we had this huge Me Too movement in Iceland. So these were younger women that gathered there to discuss their beauty routines, and somehow the question of inequality and of violence all of a sudden found its place there, and they participated in it. And I found it amazing. The young women and young people today, I think that, I admire their courage, and I hear things that I haven't heard before. And we just need to be very careful not to lose them, and very careful to give them platform and give them space to express themselves.
I love that example.
Yeah, and I think it also goes to show what Tatjana was saying, is that you never know where the safe spaces are, to have an impact. For me, I think there's a couple of my students who are non-binary, just helping me realize that things like toilets matter. We need to think about facilities, we need to think about access to basic needs, etc. And being able to be the person that goes in meetings like at the University Council and saying like, no, okay, it's not okay if we're delaying on this because like funds are tight or whatever, because people need to be able to go to the bathroom in a place where they don't get discriminated against or ostracized. And I think it's just that these people are willing to share their fights, the resistance that they meet in their daily lives, that people like me are able to support them.
Yeah, Silja, let me ask. So, Silja, as a university professor, a feminist university professor, can you talk about how you teach and what you teach to try to nurture this younger generation and help them see the world differently?
The change that I've experienced over the almost 20 years that I've been teaching now is when I taught feminist theories 20 years ago, I met with resistance, that students felt it was an irrelevant issue. There was always the couple of women students who were like, oh, that's interesting. But the bigger group would be like, why do I need to know this? This is a non-issue. By now, they all participate. They think it's obvious that this is a relevant concern. But now when I'm bringing like queer theory into the classroom, that's where they light up. And, when we're showing them like that's where the resistance is now, and bringing in the critical race theory, and that's where they're being challenged. And they ask the more interesting questions.
Yeah. So we always have a final question for our interviews that we call collective dreaming. So this year, 2025, marks the 50th anniversary of the 1975 Icelandic women's strike, or the Women's Day Off, when women across the country refused to work, including in the house, so domestic work, to protest against wage discrepancies and unfair labor practices. But if we project another 50 years into the future, imagine Iceland has not only made further strides in achieving gender equality, but it's also become a leader in an international movement to advance gender equality and peace. What do we need to do in our lifetimes to get to that point? Tatjana, can I start with you?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I think we should look at the whole world as our playground. I don't think we should focus only on Iceland and how things are done here and being perfect and being the best version of ourselves, because everything is interconnected. Famous women's strike in 75. I'm very often asked, how did it happen? How did women did they just show up? No, they didn't show up. There was a whole year of preparations, of conferences, of meetings, of gatherings. Why did women start doing that? It's because the UN proclaimed that year as a year of a woman and the whole decade. So, as much as we'd like to say that we thought of this all, no, it came from somewhere else. So that's and I do hope that we will. I'm sure we will have other challenges, but I do hope that the gender equality and all the equality issues, and I know I'm speaking now in the wake of many changes in your country. I do hope we will reach an agreement that equality is for good and that it advances societies, not that it's something that is unnecessary or even something that shouldn't be implemented in order to protect women.
Yeah. Silja, what do you think we should do in our lifetimes?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is, I like what Tatjana said, is to recognize where ideas come from, that they don't come from a vacuum or appear in a vacuum, that there is an interconnected world where, for the abortion example, the work that we're seeing in Latin America is amazing, and the transformation that we're seeing there just is so important. And I think we in the West, or maybe in the Nordic countries, we have sort of an exceptionalist approach that, things here are so good that we should be a model, whatever. We need to look to the margins, look at the people whose voices are marginalized and lift those and amplify those, because that's where progress will come from. And we need to be prepared. The event in 1975, I was living in a small town in the north and I was 4, so I don't have a memory of it. But reading about it, it seems like it came as a surprise to the system, to men, to patriarchy. But that's because it was prepared in silence, in the homes. And so prepare, resist oppression, lift the marginalized voices, and that's where there's opportunity for progress. Because people like in my position with high education, native born, able-bodied, all of this, my rights are not the main concern right now. It's how to get people who don't enjoy the rights that we've already secured, move them towards our rights.
Yeah, keep expanding the circle.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining me in this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good luck.
If it wanted to, the Icelandic gender equality movement could look at its global rankings and rest on its laurels. But what Silja and Tatjana described is a dynamic and evolving movement. It's probing new issues, like sexual and gender-based violence, and it's being challenged by younger generations. The debates keep it relevant. And while there are certainly traits that make Iceland unique, Tatjana and Silja offered advice we can all use. Ground efforts at the very local level, address problems that people face in their everyday lives, and demand a seat at the table where decisions are made. As a final note, I want to draw attention to their point that, as it turns out, fathers love their children and want to spend time with them. Increasing gender equality improves everyone's quality of life. Thanks for listening to Disrupting Peace. I'm Bridget Conley. You can find out more about Tatjana's work through the Icelandic Women's Rights Association website. Learn more about Silja's research and teaching through the website of the University of Iceland. Unfortunately, I can't pronounce the URLs, and they'd be tough to remember, but you can find them in our show notes. Next week on Disrupting Peace, we're looking at how South Korea successfully overturned the president's attempt to declare martial law.
The first clause of the proclamation of martial law was restricting the National Assembly's activities. So that by itself is very unconstitutional, and South Korea was not going through a severe crisis, so it was not justifiable.
Disrupting Peace is a production of the World Peace Foundation. Find out more at worldpeacefoundation.org. And we've moved from X to Blue Sky, where you can find us at worldpeacefdtn.bsky.social. You can also find us on Instagram at worldpeacefdtn. The show is produced by myself and Emily Shaw. Engineering by Jacob Winnick and Asia Simpson. Marketing and social media by Emily Room. Show artwork by Simon Fung. Special thanks to Jeremy Helton, my colleagues, Lisa Avery, B. Arneson, and Alex Duvall, and the team from the Tufts Digital Design Studio, including Kimberly Lynn Ferrero-Arnias and Miles Donovan. Okay, until next time, stay skeptical and hopeful.